I never thought the sound of rushing water could erase an entire lifetime. But that night it did, carrying my house, my photographs, my wedding ring, and my sense of safety away in a roaring brown river that swallowed everything I loved while I stood barefoot in the rain, shaking, praying, and realizing that survival sometimes feels exactly like dying slowly alone, unnoticed, unheard, as neighbors watched from windows and emergency sirens wailed somewhere distant, promising help that never reached me. The old woman everyone used to know, but no longer cared to save that night at all anymore somehow. This story begins there, but before you turn away, thinking you know how it ends, please pause, breathe with me, and listen carefully. Because what happened after the flood is darker, stranger, and more unbelievable than the water itself. And if you value stories of survival, justice, and truth, subscribe now. Because this channel tells the stories others are afraid to tell. Also, before we go on, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Which country, which city, because these stories travel far, and I read every comment, especially from people awake late, listening, remembering, and hoping with me tonight. My name is Margaret. I am 68 years old, and until the flood, I believed family was the one thing money could not rot. But I was wrong, painfully wrong. And when the river destroyed my small wooden home, I learned that wealth changes how people hear your voice, how quickly doors close, and how invisible an old woman can become overnight. My children married rich. My sisters moved into gated lives. And when I asked for help, they offered sympathy, excuses, silence, and numbers for shelters, as if love had a price tag I could no longer afford. The night after the flood, I slept in a school gym with strangers coughing and crying around me. But humiliation burns hotter than cold floors. And by morning, I promised myself I would not beg again. So I took the only job that would hire me fast, a night cleaning shift at a distribution warehouse near the highway. It paid little, hurt much, and started at midnight, but it was honest, quiet, and mine. And it kept me moving forward. Even when my heart felt heavier than the mop, the bucket, and the memories I carried home alone every morning. I did not have a car, and buses stopped running before my shift ended. So every night, I walked to the highway shoulder, hoping for luck. And that is where I met him, the truck driver who would change everything. A man named Daniel, with tired eyes, gentle hands, and a voice that never rushed. He drove the same route nightly, hauling produce, and when he saw me, soaked, limping and old, he stopped without questions, saying only, "Get in, ma'am." Like kindness was still normal, still free, still human. Something my family forgot long ago, and something I needed. Every night after that, I packed him a sandwich, plain bread, cheese, sometimes tomato, because gratitude must be fed. And he never asked for it, but he smiled each time, and we talked about weather, work, and the quiet pain of being invisible in a loud world. I told him nothing about my family, my losses, or my past, and he never pried, just drove, steady, safe, until tonight, the night everything broke again, when he passed my stop, locked the doors, and whispered, shaking, "We can't stop, Margaret. Your husband is watching us," and my heart stopped beating altogether. I had not heard my husband's name in 3 years, not since the funeral, not since I buried him with my own hands. So when Daniel said that word, husband, the world tilted, and fear crawled up my spine as he handed me his phone, fingers trembling. On the screen was a blurry photo, taken minutes earlier, of a man standing in an alley near my workplace, wearing a coat I recognized. eyes hidden by shadow, posture familiar, impossible, alive, and staring straight at the truck's headlights, like he knew me, knew my routine, knew I would be inside. My husband, declared dead, mourned, buried, stood breathing in that photo, and before I could scream, Daniel said there was more and swiped to a video that showed the man stepping closer, smiling, raising a hand I remembered too well. A ring glinted under streetlight, my ring, the one washed away by floodwaters, or so I thought. And suddenly I understood. The flood was not an accident. My family knew. And the man I loved had been watching, waiting, and planning for years, while I starved, worked, and trusted strangers more than blood, love, or marriage ever again that night. Daniel drove faster, refusing to stop, explaining my husband had been seen near the shelter, near the warehouse, always watching, always hiding, and that he recognized the man from missing posters years ago, a man who had faked his death for insurance money. My wealthy family helped, took the payout, split it, and left me poor, broken, and alone, believing grief would keep me quiet. But they did not count on kindness, sandwiches, a truck driver, or an old woman with nothing left to lose. And tonight, the truth finally chased us down a dark highway, past my stop, forever. As the truck disappeared into the night, I realized survival was only the beginning, and justice was waiting ahead. But before I tell you what we did next, what choice I made, and how the flood exposed a crime buried deeper than any river could reach, remember to comment where you're watching from, because this story belongs to every forgotten voice. If you stay, you will hear everything, every betrayal, every lie, and every moment an old woman stood up again, not as a victim, but as a witness, a survivor, and the one thing they never expected, still standing. The truck's engine roared louder as the road stretched empty ahead of us, and my hands shook in my lap while my mind refused to accept what my eyes had seen. Because grief teaches you that the dead stay dead, and love teaches you to trust what you buried. Yet fear has a way of tearing open every grave you thought was sealed forever. Especially when truth comes back wearing a familiar face you loved once deeply and trusted completely, without question. Daniel kept checking his mirrors, his jaw tight, his kindness replaced by urgency, and he told me to stay low, explaining that the man had followed his truck before, slowly, carefully, like a hunter learning a trail, and that tonight was the first time he felt sure it was connected to me, to the stops, to the routine we never questioned, because routine feels safe until someone else learns it better than you. I tried to speak, but memories collided in my throat. My husband's laugh, his promises, the funeral rain, the closed casket, the condolences from family members who cried loudly but avoided my eyes. And suddenly, every strange detail I once dismissed began rearranging itself into something sharp and deliberate. Like puzzle pieces snapping together too late to undo the picture they formed so clearly now. Daniel said he recognized the coat because he'd seen it in police bulletins years ago, connected to a fraud investigation quietly buried, and he admitted he hesitated telling me earlier because he didn't want to frighten an old woman already carrying too much weight alone through dark nights and silent roads. But tonight, the man stepped too close. Close enough to be certain. Close enough to smile. The highway lights blurred as tears filled my eyes, not from fear alone, but from betrayal so deep it hollowed me out, because while I slept on gym floors and scrubbed toilets at midnight, my husband lived somewhere else, breathing, watching, protected by money and family who chose him over me, without hesitation or explanation. Turning blood into strangers and marriage into a weapon used quietly against me. I asked Daniel why he helped me, why he stopped that first night when everyone else passed by. And he said, "Sometimes you see someone standing exactly where you once stood, invisible, desperate, and praying for one decent human to notice. And that maybe kindness is how ordinary people push back against a world that rewards cruelty and silence more than truth or compassion." He pulled off onto a rest stop, lit by harsh white lights, but did not unlock the doors. Instead, calling someone he trusted, a retired officer who owed him a favor, explaining everything quickly while I listened, heart pounding, realizing that survival now depended on strangers again, not family, not wealth, but people who chose decency when no one was watching or paying them to care. While we waited, Daniel asked me questions I never expected about my husband's habits, scars, lies, things only a wife would know, and each answer confirmed the impossible, strengthening the terrible certainty that the man in the alley was not a ghost or mistake, but someone who calculated his disappearance carefully, using a flood, a body, and a grieving wife as convenient tools. I remembered the insurance papers my sister insisted I sign quickly, the legal language I didn't understand, the sudden generosity afterward that never reached me, and I understood now why my requests for help were denied so easily. Because guilt is quieter when the victim remains poor, tired, and isolated, unable to fight back or be believed over polished smiles and expensive lawyers. A patrol car finally arrived, lights off, and the officer listened without interruption, studying the photo, nodding slowly. Then, saying words that chilled me, that this was not the first time the man resurfaced near me, that reports existed, ignored, minimized, buried under influence and donations. But that tonight changed everything, because now there was a witness willing to speak. He unlocked the doors and told me I had a choice: disappear quietly again, or come forward and expose a truth that would burn every bridge I had left, including family, reputation, and the fragile peace I rebuilt from nothing. And as I stepped out under the cold lights, I realized the flood took my house, but silence would take my soul if I stayed quiet now. I looked at Daniel, at the officer, at the dark highway stretching forward, and I chose to speak, not because I was brave, but because fear had already taken enough from me, and whatever waited next could not be worse than living erased, lied about, and hunted by the man I once loved while everyone else looked away deliberately. The officer drove me to a small station just off the highway. Nothing grand or intimidating, just fluorescent lights, chipped paint, and a desk that smelled of old coffee. And for the first time since the flood, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not comfort, not safety, but the strange relief of finally being seen by someone who did not turn away when the truth sounded inconvenient or expensive. They gave me water and a blanket, and as I sat there, shivering, I began telling everything from the beginning. Not just about the man in the alley, but about the marriage, the small lies that once felt harmless, the way my husband controlled money while pretending generosity, the subtle isolation from friends, the arguments that ended with silence instead of resolution. All the quiet warning signs I ignored because love teaches you to doubt yourself before you doubt the person you chose. As I spoke, memories surfaced that suddenly made sense. His insistence on life, insurance updates, his sudden interest in flood zones, his late-night calls he said were work, and the way he pushed me to move closer to the river despite my unease. Brushing off my fears as old woman worries, convincing me safety was an illusion everywhere. So why not live cheaply and save money? A suggestion that now felt less like frugality and more like preparation. The officer typed steadily, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and I realized how carefully my husband had designed his disappearance. How the flood created chaos perfect for lost bodies, destroyed records, and rushed decisions. How a coffin can be closed for dignity while hiding the fact there is no body inside, only assumptions wrapped in sympathy and sealed with signatures from grieving relatives eager to move on with their inheritances. When I mentioned my family, the officer's expression tightened, and he asked names, businesses, connections, and I watched as his screen filled with notes, understanding that my silence had protected more than one man, that the betrayal was shared, coordinated, and profitable, and that I was never meant to survive long enough to question it, let alone stand here recounting it calmly under fluorescent lights. Hours passed, and exhaustion crept in, but I refused to stop, afraid that if I rested the courage would drain away, leaving me hollow again. So I kept talking about the night of the flood, how my husband insisted I stay behind while he checked something, how he never returned, how neighbors said they saw him swept away, how quickly grief became paperwork, and how quickly paperwork became money that never reached me. Just before dawn, another officer arrived, older, quieter, and he listened differently, with patience that came from seeing too many truths buried by convenience. And when I finished, he said softly that they believed me, that they had suspected insurance fraud tied to staged deaths before, but rarely with living spouses left behind so completely abandoned, and that my willingness to speak now might finally break something long protected. They offered me a safe place to stay, not a shelter, not a gym, but a small apartment used for witnesses, and I almost laughed at the irony. How losing everything led me here, guarded, hidden, valued for the truth I carried rather than the possessions I lost. And as I lay down that morning, I cried not for my house or marriage, but for the years I spent believing I was unworthy of help. Daniel visited later that day, bringing soup and that same quiet kindness. And he apologized for pulling me into danger, though I told him he had pulled me out of it, because without him, I would have stepped off that truck, walked into the dark, and possibly never been seen again. Erased neatly like the flood erased my home, leaving only questions no one cared to answer. That evening, the officer returned with news that surveillance near the warehouse caught the man again, clearer. This time, that his movements suggested he was getting nervous, that people who hide eventually slip, especially when the person they thought broken starts speaking loudly, and that my testimony was already causing ripples among those who thought the past was settled permanently. As night fell, I sat by the window, watching unfamiliar streets, feeling the weight of what I had set in motion, knowing my family would soon hear, would deny, would accuse me of confusion, age, bitterness, anything to discredit an old woman daring to disturb their comfortable lives. But I also felt something steadier beneath the fear, a sense that truth, once spoken, grows stronger each time it is repeated. I understood then that the flood did not just destroy my home. It exposed every weak foundation beneath it, and that my survival was not an accident, but a reckoning, one that demanded I keep going, keep speaking, even when it hurt. Because silence had already cost me everything, and I would not pay that price again. The next few days unfolded like a slow, burning storm, quiet on the surface, but charged underneath. And I learned quickly that once you choose to tell the truth, time stops being yours. because interviews, statements, and questions arrive in waves that don't care about your age, your exhaustion, or the years you spent being ignored before anyone decided you mattered at all. Investigators came in pairs, sometimes 3 at a time, each with files thicker than my arm, and they asked me to repeat details again and again, not because they doubted me, but because repetition exposes cracks liars cannot keep sealed. And every time I spoke my husband's name out loud, it lost some of its power to frighten me, becoming less of a shadow and more of a man who made choices and would now face consequences. They showed me records I had never seen, shell companies, property transfers, donations to foundations my relatives sat on the boards of, and suddenly the distance my wealthy family kept after the flood made sense, because proximity brings questions, and questions are dangerous when you're living off a lie built carefully over years, reinforced by money and shared guilt. One investigator explained gently that my husband had likely planned his disappearance for at least 2 years, slowly moving assets, testing alibis, building a narrative that painted him as a tragic victim of nature, while turning me into a dependent afterthought, someone too grief-stricken, too old, and too poor to challenge the story written around me without my consent. I felt anger rise, then sharp and unfamiliar, not loud but steady, the kind that doesn't scream but refuses to back down. Because while grief broke me at first, survival rebuilt something harder inside me, something that understood I had already lived through the worst part, being abandoned by everyone who claimed to love me. And that facing the truth could not hurt more than that. At night, sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of Russian water and locked doors. But each morning I woke with a clearer sense of purpose. And when they asked if I was willing to testify, to confront my husband and my family publicly, I surprised even myself by saying yes without hesitation. Because fear loses its grip once you decide what matters more than safety. Daniel continued to check in, sometimes sitting quietly with me, sometimes talking about ordinary things, like routes, weather, and food, grounding me when my thoughts spiraled, and I realized how rare it is for someone to offer companionship without expectation. Especially to an old woman, society has decided no longer contributes anything worth noticing. The officers warned me that my family would likely reach out soon, not with apologies, but with pressure, guilt, and offers meant to buy silence. And when my sister finally called, her voice dripping with concern that never reached her eyes, I felt strangely calm, listening as she spoke about forgiveness, unity, and moving on, hooking every word to the unspoken condition that I stop cooperating. I told her no, simply, clearly. And when she accused me of destroying the family, I answered that the family destroyed itself long before the flood, that water only revealed the cracks they had been hiding behind polished smiles and generous donations. And when she hung up, I felt lighter, as if another invisible weight had finally been set down. The day they arrested my husband, I was not present, but they showed me the footage later. Him stepping out of a luxury apartment, hair grayer, posture stiff, still wearing that same ring, my ring, and the sight of it no longer shattered me, because I saw him clearly now, not as the man I loved, but as someone who chose money and control over truth and loyalty. Charges followed quickly: insurance fraud, conspiracy, falsifying death records, obstruction, and more still being uncovered. And with each headline I imagined people hearing my story, maybe recognizing pieces of their own lives, understanding that betrayal doesn't always look violent or loud. Sometimes it wears patience, planning, and a gentle smile meant to disarm you. When they asked me how I felt, I told them the truth, that justice does not erase loss, but it gives it meaning, and that while I could never recover the years stolen from me, I could make sure no one else was erased as quietly as I was. Left standing in the rain while everyone else counted money and called it closure. As preparations for trial began, I understood this was no longer just my story, but a mirror held up to a system that listens to wealth faster than it listens to pain. And as an old woman who once slept on a gym floor, I had become something unexpected, a witness whose voice could not be drowned out, not by floods, not by family, and not by the man who thought I would stay silent forever. The weeks leading up to the trial felt unreal, like living inside someone else's life, because every morning I woke up in a clean, quiet apartment that was not mine, surrounded by protection I never asked for until I needed it. And every night I lay awake thinking about how easily all of this could have ended differently if one truck driver had not stopped on a dark road. Lawyers coached me gently, never rushing, explaining how the courtroom would feel colder than it looks on television, how my family would sit together, rehearsed and composed, how my husband would avoid my eyes at first, and then try to meet them later, searching for weakness, nostalgia, anything he could use to regain control of the story he once owned completely. I practiced my testimony until my voice no longer shook, until the words became facts instead of wounds. Because emotion is powerful, but clarity is lethal to lies, and every detail I remembered became a thread tying him to a plan too precise to deny, too documented to escape, no matter how much money once shielded him. The first time I entered the courthouse, cameras flashed and I almost turned back, overwhelmed by the attention, by the sudden interest in a woman no one helped when she begged quietly for a place to sleep. But the officer walking beside me reminded me that visibility is frightening only until you realize it is the one thing liars fear most. Inside, the room buzzed with murmurs, and when I saw my family seated together, expensive clothes, carefully neutral expressions, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, but distance, as if they were already strangers, bound by secrets rather than love. And I understood that whatever happened next, there was no version of this where we returned to what we were before. My husband entered last, guarded, older than I remembered, yet still carrying himself with the confidence of someone who believed he could talk his way out of anything. And when his eyes finally met mine, I did not look away, because the power he once held lived in my silence, not his presence. When I took the stand, the room quieted, and I spoke slowly, telling my story from the beginning, not dramatizing, not accusing, just stating what happened, how the flood came, how he vanished, how quickly grief turned into paperwork, and how quickly family turned into strangers who benefited while I lost everything without explanation or assistance. The defense tried to paint me as confused, traumatized, unreliable, and I expected that. But what they did not expect was how prepared I was, how every question they asked had an answer grounded in dates, documents, and patterns, and how age, instead of weakening my credibility, lent it weight, because I had lived long enough to recognize when truth is being avoided deliberately. When they showed the photo from the alley, the courtroom shifted, and when I described the ring, my ring, the one symbol of a marriage I believed in, I felt something inside me close for good, not with bitterness, but with finality. Because love does not survive deception that deep, and grief does not require forgiveness to heal. Daniel testified after me, steady and calm, describing the routine, the sandwich, the night he locked the doors, and his voice carried the quiet authority of someone with nothing to gain by lying. And I saw jurors lean forward, understanding that this story was not about one woman's pain, but about a pattern of exploitation enabled by silence and money. As days passed, more evidence emerged: financial trails, recorded calls, witness statements. And even members of my family took the stand, some defiant, some shaken, but all exposed, because lies collapse under their own weight once truth is allowed to breathe openly in the same room. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, I did not cry, I did not smile, I simply exhaled, because justice is not a celebration, it is a correction, a restoring of balance where something was taken unfairly. And no sentence could give me back my lost years. But it could stop the damage from spreading further. Afterward, reporters asked what I would do next, and I told them the truth, that I did not know yet, that for the first time in years, my future was unwritten, not dictated by floods, husbands, or families who decided my worth without asking me. And that uncertainty felt like freedom. As I left the courthouse, the sky was clear, and I realized that while the flood destroyed my home, it also washed away the lies built around my life, leaving me standing in something raw but real, ready to choose what came next on my own terms. Life after the trial moved more quietly, but not more easily, because freedom carries its own weight when you are no longer reacting to danger, and instead must decide who you want to be without it. And I found myself standing in that unfamiliar space where survival ends and living must begin deliberately. The state offered compensation, modest but meaningful. And while it could never replace my home or the years stolen, it allowed me to choose stability instead of scrambling, and I used it carefully, renting a small house away from the river. One story, solid walls, nothing grand, but safe. And for the first time since the flood, I slept through the night without listening for rushing water or footsteps outside. Neighbors came slowly, cautious at first, then warmer, bringing bread, soup, and questions they did not ask aloud. And I learned that people are kinder when truth has already cleared the air. When you are no longer carrying secrets that make others uneasy without knowing why. And I found comfort in simple conversations about gardens, weather, and the ordinary rhythm of days uninterrupted by fear. Daniel visited once a week, sometimes more, never overstaying, never intruding, and our friendship settled into something steady and respectful, built not on trauma, but on shared understanding. And I realized how rare it is for relationships to grow without obligation, debt, or expectation, especially at my age, when society assumes your story is finished, and nothing new is meant to begin. I returned to work briefly, not because I needed the money, but because routine grounds me. And the warehouse felt different now, smaller somehow, less threatening. And when I told my supervisor I was leaving to rest, to live, to finally choose myself, he hugged me, surprising us both, and said he was proud. Words my family never offered, even when I deserved them most. Letters arrived from strangers who heard my story, women, men, people younger than my grandchildren, thanking me for speaking, for showing them that silence is not dignity, and that being abandoned does not mean you are wrong. And I read every one carefully, understanding that stories carry power, not because they are dramatic, but because they remind people they are not alone. Some nights I still dream of the flood, of the water rising too fast. But now the dreams end differently, with me stepping onto higher ground instead of being swept away, and I wake knowing that healing does not erase memory, it reshapes it, turning fear into caution, pain into wisdom, and loss into a boundary that protects you going forward. My family did not reach out again, and I did not reach for them, because reconciliation requires accountability, not just shared blood. And I learned that chosen family, built through respect and care, can be stronger than the one you are born into when birthright is used as leverage instead of love. On the anniversary of the flood, I visited the river, standing at a distance, watching the water move calmly now, deceptively harmless. And I thanked myself for surviving, for continuing, for not letting the story end where others wanted it to. Because survival is an act of defiance when the world expects you to disappear quietly. I fought often about the woman I was before everything happened. Trusting, dependent, afraid to disrupt peace. Even when peace was built on lies, and I felt compassion for her instead of shame. Because she did the best she could with what she knew, and growth does not require self-punishment, only honesty. If you are listening to this and feel erased, ignored, or abandoned, know this: your worth is not measured by who helps you when it is convenient, but by your willingness to stand when it is hard. And your voice matters even if it shakes, even if others try to silence it with money, reputation, or fear. I lost a house, a marriage, and a family, but I gained something stronger: clarity, autonomy, and the knowledge that survival is not the end of the story. It is the turning point, and everything that comes after belongs to you if you are brave enough to claim it. Api, there is a strange quiet that comes after everything is finally over. Not the peaceful kind people imagine, but a reflective silence where you begin to hear your own thoughts clearly for the first time in years. And that was where I found myself, sitting on my small porch at dusk, listening to cicadas, realizing I no longer felt hunted by the past or chased by fear. I started volunteering at the same shelter I once slept in, not because I owed them anything, but because I remembered how it felt to be handed a blanket without eye contact, to be processed instead of seen. And I made it a point to sit with people, to learn names, to listen, because dignity is restored in conversation, not charity. Some of the women reminded me of myself, newly displaced, ashamed of asking, still believing family would come through if they waited long enough. And I never shattered that hope directly, but I encouraged preparation, independence, and documentation. The quiet tools that protect you when love becomes conditional without warning. The river flooded again 2 years later, smaller, contained, managed better this time. And I watched the news coverage carefully, noticing how quickly tragedy turns into statistics, how easily human stories are compressed into numbers. And I understood then why telling my story mattered, because memory is the first casualty when inconvenience sets in. I was invited to speak at community meetings, senior centers, even small legal workshops. And standing there, gray-haired and steady, I saw disbelief soften into attention as people realized I was not a cautionary tale meant to frighten them, but proof that agency does not expire with age, and that wisdom earns its power through survival. Daniel eventually moved routes, got promoted, and though our lives drifted in different directions, the bond remained, quiet and unbreakable, built on the night kindness outran fear. And every time I pack a sandwich now, I smile, remembering how small gestures can alter the course of entire lives without announcing themselves loudly. I planted a garden behind my house, tomatoes, herbs, flowers I could not name at first, and tending to living things grounded me in the present, reminding me that growth requires patience, consistency, and trust in cycles, even after storms. Convince you that everything can vanish overnight without apology. Sometimes people ask if I forgave my husband, and I answer, honestly, that forgiveness is not a requirement for peace, that understanding is enough, and that closure comes from reclaiming your narrative, not from absolving those who chose harm repeatedly and deliberately. I keep the ring now, not as a symbol of love, but as a reminder of what blind trust costs. And I wear it occasionally when I speak publicly, because transformation does not mean erasing the past. It means integrating it, without letting it dictate your future. If this story reached you late at night, in a quiet room, while you questioned your own worth or safety, know that listening itself is an act of courage, and that awareness is the first step toward change, whether that change is leaving, speaking, or simply preparing quietly. I once believed my life ended when the flood took my home, but I understand now that endings are often disguised beginnings, especially when everything familiar is stripped away and you are forced to build from truth instead of habit. This is not a story about revenge, miracles, or sudden wealth. It is a story about endurance, about the power of noticing one another, and about how one locked door, one whispered warning, and one choice to speak can ripple outward in ways you never see coming. If you stayed until now, thank you for listening. And remember that survival is not passive. It is an ongoing decision made daily, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, but always with intention. And wherever you are watching from tonight, your story is still unfolding.